you can grab water over there. Okay, so I am now introducing Dave Dunning, who is going to introduce our special guest this evening. So join us for Exploring the Mind.
No, I'm not the one. Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jacinta Beehner, who is a professor of both psychology and anthropology at the University of Michigan, where she also directs the Evolution and Human Adaptation program. She is a behavioral ecologist and a primatologist whose research focuses on sexual conflict, reproductive strategies, and the physiology underlying social behavior in wild primates. She received her undergraduate degree in biology from Boston College and her PhD in biological anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis. And after quick stops at Penn and at Princeton, she came here to the one true academic stop in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She has led the Simien Mountain Gelada research project in Ethiopia since 2005 and administers the Capuchins at the Taboga field project in Costa Rica since 2017. Her work integrates behavioral, hormonal, and ecological data to understand how social and environmental stressors shape fitness. She directs 2 endocrine laboratories, one here at the University of Michigan and one at her field site in Costa Rica that specializes in non-invasive hormonal analysis. She's an elected fellow of the Animal Behavior Society and serves on the Science and Executive Committee of the Leakey Foundation. I don't want to provoke any more anxiety, so let me introduce Jacinta as she talks about the stress response in humans and animals, friend or foe.
Thank you, Dave. That was a nice introduction, and I really am so thrilled to have you all here today. Yes, so I'm going to do more than just present my latest study, although that's eventually where I'll get to. But I want to situate it deeply into the theory of stress physiology. So we all read about stress, and the setup's always the same, and I've even done this myself. So there's a sentence somewhere that says, we know that the acute stress response is adaptive, but when it goes on for too long, it becomes a problem. But there's 2 things that have kind of always bothered me about this phrasing. First of all, what evidence do we have that it's adaptive? And secondly, is it really a problem? So with these questions on your mind, I just want you to understand these are my motivations for writing this talk. So I'll explore all the ways in which the stress response is not just our foe, but also our friend. Probably should have flipped those, foe or friend. And to do this, I'm going to take you on a journey from pre-World War II at McGill University in Canada to the Amboseli National Park in Kenya, to the Okavango Delta in Botswana, and all the way to the tropical forests of Central America, where you'll witness one of the worst droughts on record. And with that, I'll begin. All right, so let's start with the man who gave stress its modern meaning, Dr. Hans Selye. So it's 1936. Selye is an Austrian-Hungarian biochemist, and he's seeking to make his name as this young assistant professor at McGill University in Montreal. He's looking for some exciting research project, and it just so happens a biochemist down the hall has just isolated an unknown chemical or an unknown hormone from an ovary. Nobody knows what the stuff does. So Selye decides, okay, that's it. I'm going to figure out what this ovarian hormone does. So he goes down the hall, he gets a bunch of the hormone from his buddy, and he comes back and starts injecting his lab rats with it. But apparently, Selye's not all that great at handling lab rats. He gets bitten, he drops them, he drops one, he drops another, he chases them all over the lab, and he uses the broom to fish them out from under the refrigerator. So weeks go by, and he gets a little bit better, but he's still a miserable animal handler. Finally, when his experiment's over, he euthanizes the rats, and then he dissects them to examine the effects of this ovarian hormone. And all of the rats that he dissects have peptic ulcers. He's euphoric. He's just discovered the effect of this ovarian stuff on the body. it gives you peptic ulcers. But Selye, being a good scientist, has also run a control group. And this control group have been getting the exact same shots, injections as the test group. He's been dropping them just like the other ones. And so just like with the other rats, when he dissects them, he finds that they too are riddled with peptic ulcers. Now, most of us might give up at this point and apply to business school, thinking we're not cut out to be a scientist. But Selye's thinking about this, and he says to himself, wait a minute, so this has nothing to do with the ovarian stuff that I injected. And when he thought about what do these two groups of rats have in common, it occurred to him, let's see, well, I'm pretty bad at handling lab rats. So maybe what I'm seeing is just some sort of generalized response of the body to an unpleasant experience. They've all been handled improperly. They've been injected with a needle day in and day out. So to test this, he put some of the same rats up on the roof of the building in the winter. He put them down in the boiler rooms in the summer. He put them in rooms with loud noises, in rooms with cats, and every single time he saw the exact same phenomenon. These rats were riddled with stomach ulcers, shrunken thymuses, enlarged adrenal glands, the works. So he called this mysterious reaction to aversive and unpleasant stimuli stress. And in doing so, he introduced the concept of stress to the field of physiology. Now, Selye didn't invent the term stress. Stress was already a well-known term used in the field of engineering, and he had just borrowed it from them. So stress is this external force that's applied to a structure, which they basically can be either tension, compression, shearing, bending, or torsion, and they're all indicated by the red arrows here in the photo. So you can see why Selye chose this term, since in both cases, stress is an external force that challenges a structure or an organism. But here's where he makes a huge linguistic mistake. So he uses the term stress to describe both the cause and the effect. Engineering, on the other hand, was a bit more exact in its science. So in engineering, they use the term stress as the external force that's applied to an object, but they use a different term, a term called strain, to describe the deformation or the breakdown of the structure that results from the stress. So this is indicated by the dark blue shape compared to the light blue shape in the diagram. So if too much stress builds up in a bridge, in the supports of the bridge, then the strain causes them to twist, crack, and ultimately give way. So the damage was already done before Selye realized his mistake. So in 1936, he published the results of his rat studies in the journal Nature, and in so doing, he became known as the father of the stress concept. But because of this linguistic mistake, he was later mocked when someone took several of his the transcripts from his public lectures, and they spun different lines that he had said together to form the following fake quotation of his. Stress, in addition to being itself, is also the cause of itself and the result of itself. Selye got the joke. He understood, and he bemoaned, and he even is known to have said, "I wish I was the father of the strain concept." But to be honest, the joke still describes about half the scientific literature that today exists on stress. There is this confusion between the cause, the effect, and in some cases, the downstream effects. So when we say a person has too much stress, what are we saying? Are we referring to the challenge that they have to deal with? Are we referring to the way they feel because of these challenges? So with that brief history into some of the confusion, I want to sort out three interrelated stress concepts here. The first term is the term stressor. So a stressor simply is any stimulus that's aversive, unpredictable, or uncontrollable. So originally it was described as any stimulus that is stressful, but that gets a bit circular. So we're going to go with aversive, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. Okay, the second term is the stress response. So this is the physiological or sometimes behavioral response to a stressor. And most in this talk, we're going to be talking about physiological responses that organisms produce, but ultimately it does get translated into behavior if an organism is going to mitigate the effects of the stressor. Okay, the last term, and this is the one that is most misunderstood of all three of them, and that's stress effects. It never quite took off, but it's a useful term, and I'll explain why as we get through the talk. So the stress effects are the costs that derive from the stress response. So you can think of this as your dues, the dues that you have to pay for enacting the stress response. So there's no free lunch. I'm sure by showing you this heart logo in itself, you can guess where this is going, and I'll get there shortly. Okay, so after stress was formally defined in 1936, two really different avenues for stress research began. The vast majority of stress research that we see in the literature, it takes place in the biomedical world on humans or animal models for humans. So this research focuses on how the stress response adversely affects human health and longevity. And I've depicted this type of stress here with a photograph from World War II of two men in the trenches suffering from the trauma and loss of a recent battle. So this is maybe the way we all think about stress. It's psychological distress, and it ultimately can make us very unwell. So this literature, which is usually in the medical literature, includes tons of examples of how chronic stress leads to anxiety, depression, systemic disease in humans. But there's a whole other less well-studied avenue for stress research, and this is where some of my research comes in. And this is in the fields of ecology and evolution. So this research examines how the stress response adaptively helps individuals survive a challenge. And so I've depicted this type of stress as a zebra trying to escape a lion. And throughout the talk, I will constantly refer to the lions as a metaphor, well, not even a metaphor, but as a stand-in for a stressor. This second line of research hasn't quite taken off the way the first one is, and all of our textbooks teach us that the stress response evolved as an adaptive response, but we mostly just take it for granted. If I were to ask anyone in the stress research business, how do we know stress is adaptive? Well, they'd almost certainly cite Addison's disease. This is a condition where if you're unable to produce cortisol, which is one of the stress hormones, you actually could die if it's not treated. Okay, so this is one of the only empirical proofs that cortisol is adaptive. People who can't make it die without it. But what else do we know about the stress response? Well, we know the mechanics of the stress response pretty well. So first, the brain has to perceive a stressor in the environment. Then the stress response system kicks in. And the first thing the brain does is it sends a neural impulse to the adrenal medulla that triggers an immediate surge in adrenaline. This is known as our fight or flight response. And the effects are immediate. They only take a fraction of a second to kick in. Your heart races, your pupils dilate, your muscles tense, and it's what allows you maybe to lift a car off a child in that instant moment. Then there's a follow-up response that kicks in about 3 minutes later. This is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress response system, also known as the HPA stress response. And again, the brain does send a signal, but this time the signal has to travel through the bloodstream. And it finally arrives at the adrenal cortex, stimulating it to secrete the star of the show today, cortisol. It's a little bit slower acting than adrenaline, but it's longer lasting. So cortisol channels long-lasting energy to our brain and our muscles. And if you're a zebra being chased by a lion, it's the greatest invention that evolution ever produced. So adrenaline kind of gets you moving, but the cortisol keeps you running until you're safe. Okay, so let's take a closer look at what the stress response, and at how the stress response works. So we know, or at least we think we know, what a good stress response looks like. So generally we want our levels of cortisol to be low. We can't have them at 0 or we'd be dead, but we want a nice low level during non-stressful times. So just enough to keep us in homeostatic balance, which we call baseline, like we want a low baseline. And then once we perceive that a stressor is coming at us, we want an instant rise, and that's what you can see here. And this is sort of what I'll be talking about a lot today, is basically the animals who are at baseline and how high do they go and how quickly do they get there. And it's this increase in cortisol that's key, because cortisol is able to modulate all kinds of decisions that our body is making every second of every day. So if this zebra is you, and you want to survive this crisis, there's some things you're going to need to do with your body. And the first one, above all else, is you need energy. So you don't want energy tucked away in your fat cells. You don't want to build a project next spring. You want energy right now, and you want it in circulation to hand over to whatever muscle cells are going to save your life. So what helps you do this? Well, cortisol. Cortisol is sent to any storage site throughout your body that's storing energy, and it empties them. It releases the easy energy first. This is in your liver, it's stored as glycogen. And when that's used up, it goes to your fat cells, and it makes them give up the goods. And when those are used up, it'll even start to break down the proteins in your body. But the idea is the same. You go to the bank, you empty out the savings account, and you turn it into cash, glucose in the bloodstream. And so all this makes perfect sense. The next thing you're going to do is also makes perfect sense. You've just dumped all this energy into your circulation, but now you need to deliver it as quickly as possible to your muscles. So what do? You increase your heart rate, your blood pressure goes up, your breathing rate goes up. You want to get that glucose. You want to get all that oxygen to your thigh muscles in about 2 seconds instead of 3 seconds. You're that much more likely to survive. Okay, so all this glucose and blood flow and adrenaline is enhancing your cognition, our learning, our memory. Have you ever heard of flashbulb memory? So flashbulb memory is that phenomenon when you remember every detail about where you were when you heard the news on 9/11 or January 6th or October 7th. The emotional content of the information sears it into our brain because it's accompanied with a little bit of a stress response. So we also experience altered immune function. Altered because sometimes things are enhanced and sometimes things are suppressed, but mostly things are suppressed. And that's why cortisone cream, that's that synthetic form of cortisol, when you put it on something, it reduces swelling. It stops the inflammation associated with a stress response. An immune response. Okay, now another thing that our bodies do during stress is we turn off all the long-term building projects. Do it later if there is a later. So we shut down digestion, and digestion takes hours and hours to happen. It's slow and it's super expensive. So there's no time for it. So what happens when we're under stress? Our mouths get dry. And that's the first step of shutting down our whole gastrointestinal system. What else? Well, we shut down growth. We shut down reproduction. There's a lion 2 steps behind us, ovulate some other time and hit puberty next week. That's a quote from Sapolsky. I didn't make that up. So these are big, expensive, optimistic things to be doing with our body, and this is no time for it. We're running for our lives. Okay, so that cascade is what keeps us alive, but there's more to a good response than just a rise in cortisol. Once we escape the lion, we need to shut it off again. Cortisol has to return to baseline once the challenge is over. The zebra shouldn't remain on high alert, or this just wastes all the resources and keeps the body from maintaining some pretty important functions. So let's go back to that list of things that cortisol is able to do in the short term, and now let's look at what happens when those things stay on. So while all the things on the left save our lives, they become more damaging if they stay on under a chronic stress effect, and they can actually be more damaging than the stressor itself, especially if the stressor is some psychological nonsense that we've made up for ourselves. So we've got this critical issue that the same stress response that's wonderfully adaptive and logical when we're running from a lion ends up tipping into harmful territory once it goes on too long. So each one of these adaptive responses is associated with a parallel and harmful long-term effect. Glucose released, well, eventually it can lead to fatigue, and then long-term, it can produce diabetes. Increased heart rate can lead to high blood pressure and cardiovascular problems. Reduction in pain can lead to neural degeneration, And basically, altered immune can be impaired disease resistance, inhibited digestion can lead to peptic ulcers, inhibited growth can lead to psychosocial dwarfism, inhibited reproduction can lead to loss of libido, infertility, and other reproductive problems. Okay. So we know from a whole bunch of laboratory research on rodents that when a stress response goes on too long, it takes a cumulative toll on an organism. So let's look at what happens to an organism who's experiencing a stress response. Here is just normal, you're just resting under normal conditions, everything's functioning perfectly. Then you get in a fight with your neighbor, and just like that, your cortisol goes through the roof. And this is just a normal response, there's no big deal. You got this, and you recover. Okay, but this isn't the end of it. The fights with your neighbor increase in frequency, and you can't escape them anymore. So your stress responses increase either in frequency or in duration, and they slowly become the ingredients for chronic stress. You start to build up the bad effects, and this buildup is what I call wear and tear. There's a more official term in the literature called allostatic load, but I like to call it wear and tear, even to very scientific audiences. I think it captures it better. So if this wear and tear goes on too long, it leads to pathology, including poor health, accelerated aging, stress-related disease, and if it goes unchecked, it can even lead to death. So all of this is well supported by the medical literature. Cardiovascular disease caused 19.8 million deaths in 2022, which is 32% of all global deaths. And many of these deaths were directly linked to a stress variable. So psychological stress isn't just uncomfortable, it's deadly. In 2023, researchers found that patients with the highest psychological distress, so that's the orange line in this graph, had nearly double the rate of heart attacks, strokes, or heart failure over a 6-year period compared to those with the lowest distress, and that's the black line. So across numerous biomedical studies, each major stressor added to someone's life, so whether it's depression or anxiety or trauma, predicts a roughly 22% higher risk of heart disease and a 23% higher risk of stroke. All right, let's look at diabetes. Well, worldwide, there's 589 million adults living with diabetes, and that number is still climbing, and stress is known to play a role. Chronic stress keeps cortisol high, as we know now, which in turn then promotes insulin resistance, which makes blood sugar harder to control. And in a 2023 study, researchers were able to tie early life adversity to neurobiological changes that led to overreactive cortisol regulation, leading to poorer glycemic control later in life. So chronic stress has the ability to rewire our body's metabolism, which links psychological adversity directly to our risk of diabetes. Okay, so most of the studies that I've just reported use self-reported stressors in humans. But what about actual cortisol levels? Well, it's pretty difficult to measure cortisol levels in living humans across their entire lives. But is there another way to dig down a little bit on this? And guess what? There are some long-term field studies where we've studied the full lives of hundreds and hundreds of non-human primates. One of them is the Amboseli Baboon Project, which has been running steady since 1970. So that's 55 years of constant monitoring of a population of yellow baboons living their regular baboon lives on the Kenyan savannah. So the Amboseli Baboon Project also has a lifetime of hormone samples from all of these individuals. So what they did was, and this was a recent study by Fernando Campos, is they looked at a female's across her entire life of stress hormones, and they wanted to basically categorize those who had high hormones across their life versus those who basically had fewer hormones across their life. And they wanted to look at, what does it look like if you have stewed in cortisol your entire life? And it probably won't come as a surprise that the baboons with the highest cortisol, and these are the ones in pink, died much earlier than their blue counterparts who had low cortisol. But what might come as a bit of a surprise is that they died 5 years earlier than the females with the lower cortisol. So baboons only live about 20 years. So this is a quarter of their life. They're living that much less because of the fact that they are stewing in high cortisol. So this was a study that intentionally used baboons as a model for humans in order to measure the toll that stress takes across your lifetime. But as useful as these data are as a model for chronic stress, they don't really help us understand what constitutes an adaptive or even a non-adaptive stress response. So if anything, our conclusion when we see these data might be that the pink baboons probably need to manage their stress response a little bit better. But let's remove our biomedical hat and let's put on our ecology and evolution hat. If we now ask which baboons have a better stress response, we start to get at the heart of the problem that I'm trying to identify in my research. Something that there's little of in the empirical literature, especially in the primate literature, which is basically, did the pink ones mess up by having an overactive stress response that killed them early? Before we answer this question, you need to remember the environment that the baboons are living in. So this is just one of the many crises that these baboons face every day of their life. So which baboons have a better stress response? Well, the answer is, you can't answer this question from the data. If you compare the pink stressed baboons to the blue unstressed ones, you're comparing apples to oranges. They're not equal comparisons. So you wouldn't compare the injuries of a bull rider to like the injuries of a librarian, you know, and say that, you wouldn't conclude that bull riders must have weaker bones because they have more bone breaks. No. You'd say the bones are breaking because of the occupational hazards around them. Well, the same is true for the baboons. The pink baboons probably had loads more challenges compared to the blue baboons, and who, for whatever reason, had fewer challenges. So it's this apples to oranges comparison that I've been focused on, maybe too focused on. And this is what's known as the court fitness hypothesis. So court is short for cortisol, which I've already introduced. So what is the court fitness hypothesis? Well, quite simply, it's the negative relationship between baseline cortisol and fitness. So as cortisol goes up, fitness goes down. I just want to back up here and just talk a tiny bit about fitness. So when I say fitness, I don't mean muscle strength, although I guess it could be muscle strength. But basically, fitness in evolutionary terms means survival and reproduction. And you have to survive so you can reproduce. And once you reproduce, your kids have to reproduce. And then your kids' kids have to reproduce. So essentially, it's how many gene copies you end up leaving in subsequent generations, however those copies get there. But for our purposes today, we can just think of it as survival, because you do have to survive if you're going to have any chance at all at reproducing. So before I show you that relationship, I want to build up the logic a bit. So we know that cortisol, okay, this is indicated here as baseline cort. We know that cortisol goes up with environmental challenges, so lions. And this is really well supported in the literature. The more stressors you have, the more likely you are to have higher cortisol, just as you should. You know, lions are stressful. So we also know that more environmental challenges lead to more deaths. This is also well supported in the literature. More lions means you're going to have a much higher chance of being killed by one. And there's nothing controversial here or here. So let's put these two figures together. The logical corollary to merging these two figures, so in other words, we've removed the environmental challenges, is what's called the court fitness hypothesis. And what this predicts is that higher cortisol is associated with lower fitness. And that's what the baboon paper reported. And there's hundreds and hundreds of studies on humans, model organisms, wild animals that provide support for this relationship. But what's the problem? Seems a done deal, no? Well, the problem is when we assume that this relationship is a causal one, that cortisol is causing the lowered fitness. Oh, but Jacinta, you're all saying, you just told us the Ambacelli baboons died earlier from stewing in their high cortisol all their life. And you're right. The wear and tear does indeed take its toll and shorten a life. But remember, there's a missing third variable, which in this case is the challenges themselves, the lions. So let's consider a scenario where lions are a very real and present danger. But let's say you have two groups of baboons with different frequencies of stressors. So one group lives in a relatively lion-free environment where attacks from lions are rare, while another group lives in an environment where they're often attacked by lions. Okay, let's consider several different possibilities for their stress response. This could be strength, it could be frequency, it could be magnitude, but the point is that when the curve goes all the way up to the top, this is a robust stress response, and when the curve is dampened like this, we call this a weak stress response. Okay, so now let's consider the outcomes for the baboons in these groups. So up here, baboons are going to survive. There are too few lions to even bother them. So it doesn't matter what their stress response is. And to be expected, these baboons also have no wear and tear from the stress response, and they live a long, healthy life. We'll call these the silver spooners. All right, let's look at the next one down. So these baboons are always running into lions. They have to be constantly vigilant, and they're climbing trees every few hours to escape lions. Their stress response bounces all over the place as they call upon all their reserves to escape the lions, and they're nervous wrecks their entire lives. But guess what? They survive. They survive the lions. Phew, all that anxiety paid off. But did it? So even though they survive the lions, remember there's no free lunch. So these baboons have been paying for each stressful day in tiny, small ways across their life. They have weakened immunity, they have elevated blood pressure, maybe they're slower to repair and grow. So not surprisingly, these baboons have shorter lifespans. Note that this shortened lifespan is the result of the wear and tear. That's what I called stress effects, not from the lions. So this last group's an important one, because this is the group that gets left out of most of our analyses. These baboons are also always running into lions, but unlike the previous group, these ones are chill. They're not vigilant, they don't have a robust stress response, they make easy prey for the lions, and guess what? They become lions' lunch. There's no need to assess the wear and tear even because they didn't live long enough for us even to measure it. So back to the court fitness hypothesis. What court fitness is doing is it's comparing this group to this group. But this is an unfair comparison, especially if we're working in ecology and evolution, because we're concerned with fitness. Evolution can't control the number of lions, but what it can control is how many baboons respond to the lions. How the baboons respond to the lions. So the comparison that evolution's making when it selects for the best stress response is this one to this one. And guess who comes out on top? This one. So survival translates to, so basically what you're looking at here is that even though they have a shortened life compared to these guys, they have a longer life compared to these guys. And so this is what's considered an adaptive response. So why does this happen? Why do we compare these two? Why does that happen? Well, there's the siren song of the massive biomedical literature that's telling us stress is bad, but there's also a classic logical error that humans are known to make. I'll explain using another World War II example. So it's World War II once again, and the US military has a big problem. So many of its bombers aren't making it back from missions over Europe. Those that do return are riddled with bullet holes. And so the military engineers want to know, how can we reinforce these planes to reduce our losses? But armor is heavy and it's expensive, and too much of it would slow down the plane and limit its range. So they needed to be strategic. Where should they add the armor? The Air Force collected data on returning bombers, mapping out where all the bullet holes were the most concentrated. And they noticed, and this is an actual photo, and they noticed that most of the bullet holes were clustered along the wings, the fuselage, the tail, and that there were almost none on the engines. And so the US military's statistical research group at Columbia University This is a wartime team of statisticians, mathematicians, economists. They were asked to analyze this problem, and guess what they concluded? They said, well, the engines don't seem to be hit much. Let's leave them as they are. Let's reinforce the places that show the most bullet damage. But among the group was a brilliant Hungarian-born statistician named Abraham Wald. And when this recommendation was put forward, he disagreed. He pointed out that their data have come from only the planes that returned from combat. So the holes they recorded, the ones you see here, are the ones that didn't bring down the aircraft. By contrast, the planes that were shot down, the ones that didn't return, likely had holes in different places. So the absence of bullet holes on the engines didn't mean the engines didn't get hit. It means that planes hit in the engines didn't survive to be counted. So in other words, the data was biased towards the survivors. So this now famous incident gave rise to the term survivorship bias or survivor bias. It's a term that describes this logical error of focusing only on those who survive while overlooking those who perish, and that makes us draw the wrong conclusions. So if we were to use these data to make similar conclusions, we're doing a similar thing. I'm talking about the damage that cortisol does on the body, in this case, a baboon body. So yes, the pink ones died earlier than the blue ones in a form of this comparison. So if we're comparing blue and pink, we're basically doing this comparison. But we don't know what those baboons would look like if they hadn't had all those years of high cortisol. It's likely they would have died much earlier than they did. So why might these hypothetical baboons exhibit a high response than those who exhibited a low response? Okay. Well, I want to just return to this slide quickly because I just want to point out the red word here is that the stress response is modified by our perception of it. And so how we perceive stressors can be really different across individuals. So one clear modifier is whether we find something stressful or not, experience. So the best example of this comes from a study on a group of men who were training to become paratroopers in the Norwegian army. And just as you'd expect, the first-time parachuters showed a huge spike in their stress hormones just before they were about to take their jump. But of course, as they gained more experience and more confidence, this physiological stress response dropped off almost to nothing. So the danger hasn't changed, but their perception of it had. What once felt dangerous now felt enjoyable. Another thing that modifies how we perceive stressors is whether it's controllable or not. So in a classic study on control, 2 groups of rats were exposed to aversive events, and in this case it was a foot shock. And one group of rats were given control over the stressor. So if they were able to press this bar, they could reduce the number of shocks that they received. The other group of rats were yoked to this first group. So they did not have a bar to press to reduce the shocks, but they received the shocks regardless. So now you have 2 groups of rats receiving the exact same shocks in the exact same pattern, but one is able to control how many they get by reducing them and the other can't. And I think you can probably see where this is going. The rats who could push the lever developed fewer ulcers than the yoked rats, even though they received the same number of shocks. So in other words, having agency protected their bodies from some of the most harmful effects of stress. So control over a stressor dramatically blunts the stress response. And I sometimes think that that's why they even put thermostats in our offices at U of M, because it feels like maybe we have some sense of control even though we're freezing. All right, the same researcher, Jay Weiss, he also extended this last study to examine predictability. So in this follow-up study, he again had two groups of rats. One was shocked. They both received foot shocks, but one group received a warning light before they got the foot shocks, and one group did not. And the rats who received the cue, allowing them to predict that they were about to get a shock, had far fewer signs of physiological stress than the rats who were shocked at random. So knowing when a bad thing is about to happen, even if you can't stop it, still makes it less damaging. Okay, another factor that heavily modifies how you interpret a stressful incident is whether you think your situation is getting better or whether you think your situation is getting worse. And for this example, I'm going to draw from some of my own work on a population of wild chacma baboons in the Okavango Delta of Botswana. And this is work I did together with Tori Bergman during our collective postdocs. So males in chacma baboons form a strict linear dominance hierarchy, where being at the top of the hierarchy means you get to mate with females. And pretty much if you're like male number 4 and further down, you don't get to mate at all. And remember, reproduction is one of the currencies of fitness. So we looked at their fecal cortisol level in relation to their dominance rank. And more importantly, we looked at it relative to the stability of the dominance hierarchy. And we found that when the hierarchy was stable, okay, so no one's challenging anyone else, everyone's in their position, the high-ranking males had it the best. They had low cortisol levels, they weren't stressed, and this makes sense. High rankers are pretty pleased with the status quo, but low rankers are not. But during these unstable periods, so the tables suddenly turned, when rank challenges did occur, it was the high-ranking males who suddenly showed higher cortisol levels compared to the lower-ranking males. And so the stress response seems to track not just where you are in the hierarchy, but how you expect things to go from that position. So if you're a high rank in a stable system, you're in a good place, but if you're high rank in a shaky system, chances are you're going to fall. Okay, outlets for frustration. This one I like to call the punching bag approach to stress. So as it turns out, if you have an outlet for frustration, you'll have a dampened stress response. One of the classic stressors that's used on rats is a restraint tube, like the one you see here. The rats aren't harmed, but it does elevate their stress response. And rats that were given a piece of wood to gnaw on while they were restrained had a much lower stress response than those without the ability to gnaw. So this suggests that having an outlet for frustration can affect whether or not you produce a high or a low stress response. Okay, and the last one I'm going to detail, and there's others as well, but is that coping mechanisms, thankfully, can help us manage stressful situations. And I want to draw again on my own work from chacma baboons. My colleagues and I looked at what happens when the dominant male is overthrown and a new male takes his place. And we're looking at the females, not the males. So when a new male takes over the dominant position, they often will kill all the infants in the group that were sired by the previous male. And so that's stressful for females. But we noticed that the females showed stress responses in coordination with their risk. So those who had kids had high cortisol, and those who were not currently lactating showed low cortisol. And that's unrelated to coping, but that's just another thing that we found. Here's where it relates to coping. So of these lactating females, some of them were able to form these close relationships with another male in the group, usually, but not always, the father of their kid. And so when they were able to do this, these at-risk females showed no increase in their cortisol compared to the at-risk females who did not have a male friend. So even under the most threatening of conditions, social support can completely buffer the stress response. Okay, so perception's important. And with humans, it gets even more complicated because most of our stressors are nothing but perception. Our stressors are psychological. I'm calling them imaginary, and I don't mean that they're actually imaginary, but I think from an evolutionary perspective, they kind of are. I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk. But back to our court fitness hypothesis, the critical point that gets lost is this. The benefits of a successful stress response are a probabilistic reduction in the likelihood of death. That's hard to measure. You know, the probabilistic reduction in the likelihood of death. No wonder we don't measure it. So the stress response saved those individuals and allowed them to live another day. But we often miss this in the final population because we only see and measure the survivors. So how do we even make this apples to apples comparison? How do we compare these individuals to these ones? to do it properly, we would need to compare each individual to themselves under an alternate reality. Since we can't do this, we need to do the next best thing. We need to examine what happens when a singular life-threatening stressor strikes all individuals equally. Now, the problem is that the challenge has to be severe enough that it threatens their fitness. And obviously, for good ethical reasons, we can't impose life-threatening experiments on most wild animals, but especially not on wild primates. But one alternative to direct experimentation is to take advantage of a natural experiment. These are becoming, unfortunately, all too common in our today's world of climate change. And I guess my feeling is while they're completely catastrophic, we still can use these events just to help us get a window into the stress response of animals leading up to and then after these challenges. So, getting into my study, one of these catastrophic incidents came in the form of an El Niño, and it hit Central and South America in late 2014. Now, El Niño events themselves aren't rare. They occur every 2 to 7 years, but the El Niño event from 2014 to 2016 was one of the top 3 most severe El Niños ever on record. So what exactly is an El Niño event? Well, in normal years, strong trade winds push warm surface water westward across the Pacific, keeping the waters near South America cool, and that's represented by this bluish tone here. But during an El Niño event, those winds weaken, and even worse, they sometimes reverse, which allows warmer water to drift eastward, and it heats up the Pacific Ocean and disrupts the weather patterns across the globe. And that's down here. The 2014 El Niño brought record heat, record droughts, followed by record floods across Central and South America. It was an extreme global-scale environmental disaster, and it was one powerful enough to test the resilience of all ecosystems and all species that were living in them. So the El Niño event was our natural experiment. Who were our subjects? In early 2015, I was contacted by my colleague, Dr. Susan Perry. She notified me that a whole bunch of her capuchins in her study population were dying due to the severe El Niño event. And this population comprises about 13 different groups of wild white-faced capuchins, which is about 200 monkeys. This was in the Lomas Barbudal Reserve in Costa Rica, and she'd been studying these monkeys since 1990. She knew all the individuals. She had rich life history on all of them. And lucky, she was collecting hormones since 2007. So when she told me about this incidence, all these deaths, it started my wheels turning on the possibility for not intervention, we're not allowed to, but at least to do some science on it. So the El Niño event caused deaths to skyrocket in this population. So here's an analysis of all the deaths in the group since 1990. And because there's different numbers of monkeys being observed each year, the dotted line is the expected number of deaths for each year based on the exposure and mean rate of deaths across years. So you can see that the number of deaths jumps up in 2015. And this is the peak of the El Niño drought. And you can see here's another El Niño event over here. So it says severe El Niño. It should just say El Niño. But this is one of the top 3 as well, El Niño events, but it wasn't even close to what happened over here. So when Susan told me about this catastrophe, it did seem like this perfect opportunity to compare the stress systems of the monkeys who survive compared to the monkeys who die. So when I approached her about this research problem, she said, well, we aren't able to, so many have died already, and we weren't able to be on the ground and get samples from them. So we still had kind of the survivor bias problem that I told you about earlier. The monkeys were already dead when we started this investigation, and unfortunately, we didn't really have sufficient samples across the El Niño event itself to analyze, what is their stress response. So how do we deal with this? Well, we reasoned that a monkey's stress response to previous droughts might also give us a window into their stress response, and that this previous response to droughts might reflect the way they would respond to a current drought. So up here you can see that the rainfall patterns in the region from 2008 to 2017. But more important for our study, down here you can see how each day scored along a drought index, which is a measure of how each day varied from what was expected for that day based on a known history of rainfall from the past 20 years. So droughts here are indicated by orange dots, and the brighter dots are associated with more severe droughts. So you can see also that the El Niño, this was very gratifying, the El Niño event here is characterized by the most severe drought indices, which helps us validate that this is a good measure. And so what we did was we actually looked at their stress responses across these previous droughts to anticipate what they probably did during the El Niño drought. So we made one assumption and one prediction. Our assumption is that we assumed monkeys' stress response during previous, less severe droughts would represent their response during the El Niño drought. We predicted that females with a stronger stress response would be more likely to survive than those with a weaker stress response. First, we built a model to control for things we know affect fecal cortisol. So collection time, age, group size, reproductive stage. Remember, we needed the El Niño event to hit all of our subjects equally, but things are never equal. Some females are pregnant, some are old, some samples were collected in the morning, some were collected in the afternoon. So we removed what we know about these factors from each monkey's profile. And then we used the estimates that were extracted from this model to build a second model to predict survival probability based on their cortisol responses. So remember, our question is, does a monkey's stress response predict whether they live or die? And this is just to remind you of what we're doing here is instead of a lion, we have El Niño, and whether they'd survive or don't survive the drought. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. So a stronger stress response predicted who would survive. Here's our subjects separated by whether they lived, up here at 1, the survivors, and whether they died, down here. And if we spread them out based on their change in cortisol, so this is their change from baseline up to their peak value, you can see that the survivors had a more positive change and the fatalities had, it should be 0, but it was actually a negative 1. So viewed a different way, here's the individual slopes for our survivors and our fatalities. And as a reminder, next to it is what a robust stress response looks like and what a weak stress response looks like. And remember, it's sort of the upslope that we're measuring from baseline to peak. Just to put this in context, a slope of 1 standard deviation above the mean increases your odds of surviving El Niño by a factor of more than 10. So this is the first data to show that a more robust stress response is adaptive in primates. There's, of course, loads of follow-up work that we want to do on this result, and that's the subject of an NSF grant that I currently have that's aiming to look at how robust this finding is, looking at different populations and looking at different stressors. And this is the work that will be carried out by one of my fabulous graduate students, Walker Stanton. Okay, so I want to return to the title of the talk, and I want to try and pull this all together. So is the stress response a friend or a foe? Well, as you've probably figured out, the stress response evolved because the benefits outweigh the costs, but only if the stressors are lethal. And guess what? Our stressors as humans rarely are lethal. Our stressors are mortgages, traffic jams, annoying bosses at work. Not you, Pretty. Elevated glucose and increases in our blood pressure do nothing at all to rescue us from these things. In fact, they probably make them worse. So we only suffer the costs of the stress response, and we never receive any of the benefits. So remember this slide. So now I want you to look at it from the human perspective, where all of our stressors are imaginary. And basically, you can imagine you have cases where individuals still live a silver spoon life. They don't even have imaginary stressors. But then you have other individuals who are constantly hit with psychological stressors. It doesn't matter what well, it does matter, but assuming that they don't really have a stress response to this, they survive, they live a nice long life. Again, silver spoon individuals. Down here, we have two options. We have individuals who might respond to every imaginary lion that's out there with a robust stress response, and then we have individuals who might, kind of be chill about it all. Both of them will survive, but this individual here will suffer from the effects, the stress effects that come from enacting a stress response throughout their life. We call this individuals under chronic stress. By contrast, these sort of chill ones end up still living, even though they're subject to all of these imaginary stressor, or real stressor. All these psychological stressors. They don't get too upset by it, and so they live this long life. And so modern day humans have a stress response that's mismatched to the stressors that we now experience. Cultural evolution has progressed much more quickly than biological evolution. So another example would be our craving for fat and sugars. This made perfect sense for most of our human history, but because these were rare, high-calorie resources that helped us survive famines. But now, those same instincts are operating in a world where calories are cheap and everywhere, and so the very adaptations that once kept us alive are now fueling an obesity epidemic. And our biology just hasn't caught up yet. A similar thing happens with inflammation. So the inflammatory response evolved to protect us from infection and injury. It's an essential short-term defense mechanism, but of course in modern life, when we're rarely fighting any pathogens, we basically have chronic psychological stress that keeps our system switched on. So the result is persistent low-grade inflammation, and this contributes to all kinds of problems. It's basically a biological defense that's been turned against us. Okay, so friend or foe? Well, it's a friend to wild animals living in the natural world. It's a foe to captive animals like us who are living in a world where evolution hasn't caught up and never will. But remember, the same stressor can be a threat or a challenge, and that's up to you. The difference lies in perception. And so knowing this, we can learn to shape our responses, and that's where resilience lives. Thank you. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I'm going to come around with the microphone. One moment.
John.
Like you said, Susan has long-term data on all these monkeys. So does she have any kind of intuition about the commonalities of those monkeys who had the low stress response that led to their fates?
So the Ambacelli project, where it was basically the one with the blue and the pink monkeys, the study that they conducted, again, it was posed as a model for understanding a lifetime of stress across your lifetime. The actual pink and blue are model estimates. They're not actual baboons, although it's produced from the data from actual baboons. And they sort of claim, I've talked to Fernando about this, and he said, when I said, were you able to control for all stressors? Which, of course, I would have said, of course you can't. But Fernando said, we tried. Like, for the things that they had data on, they controlled for those stressors. So they're kind of saying that this is supposed to be stressor-free, and that the one individual runs high and one set of individuals runs low. But I disagree. I think that there are a lot of stressors in there that went uncontrolled for.
My question is actually about Susan Perry's
Oh, Susan
Capuchins.
Perry, sorry. I thought you were talking about
Not
Susan.
Susan Alberts, I'm sorry. Too many Susans.
Okay, sorry, that's a good question. And actually, that's a whole part of my talk I had to cut out for time's sake, so I'm glad you asked it. So why, when these capuchins need it the most, why did they disappoint? They died, so of course it's major. And we obviously waved our hands in our publication, but here's the things we said. So first of all, El Niños are every 7 years, but not like that. So that's like a once in a blue moon kind of thing. So for an animal to be adapted to that kind of drought might not always occur. But still, we have some that clearly were better adapted than the others. Some of it might be related to just the variance that's out there. Like one of the weirdest things about our data set is that, let me find it. So we expect these guys to go up, and they do, but these guys are negative. You know, we should expect them to be, here at least it's still positive in our little prediction. So we thought maybe it'll be flat, but it's negative. So in other words, they actually have higher stress during maybe flooding. And so it could be, I mean, one of our kind of hand-wavy results is maybe that if it were a La Niña year, which is characterized by floods, maybe these guys would have done better. But the other possibility is just that there could be other things about these monkeys that led to their, you know, like maybe they had more early life adversity, or maybe they had other things that hurt their stress response in ways that we weren't able to measure. We tried to get at that by looking at dysregulation. So we wanted to see, does their stress response respond the normal way to wet season, dry season? And it did. So they showed everything looked great. Basically, they responded to the dry season with higher glucocorticoids the same way they did. They had low baseline the same way they did. So we weren't able to, with the limited data we had, we weren't able to identify whether dysregulation was going on, and we think it wasn't. So that doesn't answer your question, but that gets at the next step that we did do. Yeah, and that's part of our NSF follow-up, is really to get at that. It's way more boring than this in the sense that it's not death, but Walker is really looking at what are these responses repeatable? Do we see differences across different populations? And do different stressors provoke different responses? So he's kind of getting at the fine-grained stuff that we probably should have done before this one. Yes, Amelia.
Really cool research. I'm so intrigued and have so many questions for you. But actually, I'm glad you have this slide up. My question comes at the individual difference level, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the animals that you're seeing an overlap in their change in cortisol that is negative, but you have some that are living, right? Especially the ones that are so far to the left that clearly overlap with
This
the
one?
yeah,
Yeah,
right. But
so-
even the ones right before the line. So I'm curious about if you have thoughts on like the individual differences that might be driving this, that they live, and if there's any like familial thing happening here as
Right.
well.
So our sample size was small. It's 14 females. So basically 19 females died, which doesn't sound like much, but it actually is a lot for basically a 2-year period. Of those 19, 5 of them we had no hormones from. So we had to use the 14. We then matched them with 14 similar aged, in the same group, at the same time females to analyze as their counterparts. So we were able to do that. These are not my monkeys. So in other words, like I don't know the life history and all that kind of stuff about them. So but we did look at like these two and this one, and we did look at these two. There was nothing we could decipher, no rank indications, no, there was rank, the big one. We looked at reproductive categories, and we looked at age. Now, age we did control for, but if you push me up against the wall, I am not 100% that age didn't account for some of this. So as we all know, as you age, you have your stress response isn't as dynamic as it should be, maybe. So the idea might be that, you know, the El Nino, it's sort of, what am I trying to say? The El Nino showed us that the ones with a lesser stress response died, but also the ones with a lesser stress response were older. But when we looked at, like, we removed old ones and ran it again, and it was fine. So I'm saying that it wasn't the be-all, end-all for our results, but I do think age is in there somewhere, playing a role. Peter. I don't know if you do.
Yes, we do, because we're recording.
He's got a big mouth.
Oh, thank you. Is it okay if I ask a couple of questions?
Yes.
Okay, very quick. First question is, I'm curious if the public speaking is eliciting a stress response.
Yes.
Okay.
Especially
okay.
with your hand in the air.
All right, thank you. So does the stress respond within an individual? Does the stress respond to certain event attenuates over time? Because if I remember, 'cause you mentioned some of the
Like
moderators.
perception.
Experience. So I'm thinking, as a baboon, I've seen a lion. I know there's a tree. First time it freaked me out, but the second time, oh yeah, I know, I got it, I can do it. So does that happen over time? And then, and the third question is, I'm trying to figure out what is the mechanism that through which stress response helps with drought.
Oh, good one. That's a good question.
And I'm guessing the shutdown or something like that. Well, okay.
Yeah,
I'm
let me
gonna wait for
cover.
a response.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the first question was, the first one was whether I'm stressed. Yes. The second question was, sorry, give me a trigger. Attenuate, right. So perception, if in fact the stressor is stressful, if it is real and it affects your reproductive success, you shouldn't habituate to it. There should be absolutely no habituation to a stressful event that might kill you. So you shouldn't, when I said that about perception, from a human perspective, it's really important that we perceive things as being less. But from an animal perspective, I mean it more as those females. If I'm cycling, I don't care about a new male in the group. But if I'm lactating, I care deeply about a new male in the group. Same stressor, but a different perception because there's a little bit more of a motivator to interpret it through differently. So maybe those aren't fair comparisons, but I use perception in animals to be a little bit different than I use for perception in humans. The last question you asked was about the mechanism, right. So this is such a good question, and actually I got the same question at a hormone conference that I gave the same talk, not the same talk, but a different version of this talk at last week. And so if you are cold and you enact a stress response, your body starts to shiver, and you can actually produce more blood flow, you're burning calories, and all of that can keep you warm. So you can easily see how a stress response can be linked into staying warm in a cold weather. Running from a lion, easy. So there's a lot of stressors where you could see where enacting that the mechanism that I told you about would help save you from that stressor. One of the hardest ones to explain is heat. So on the one hand, it was a drought with no food. And so if your body is starting to eat itself, essentially, removing everything from fat, removing everything from your liver, starting to digest muscle tissue, which is what we think happened in some of these monkeys, you can understand how starvation is met. Not starvation, but low food, like low calorie count. You can see how a stress response might help you. Heat, if that's what we're looking at here with the drought, how does heat change? And I don't have a definitive answer because but my guess is that cortisol also has a lot to do with salt and water balance. And if you are in fact when you produce glucose, when you release glucose from your liver, you actually also release water. And having more water in your system allows you to cool that much more effectively. So it could be possibly something like that, but there actually is tons of literature in the agricultural business of cows and stuff, because they're always constantly trying to figure out how to keep their cows cool, and they're actually the best at this kind of research in looking at the effectiveness of these different mechanisms at keeping animals cool or unstressed. Yes.
So I was wondering, within all the studies and data that you've seen from all these primates, if you noticed that the child of creatures that had undergone more stress in their lifetimes had been more resilient to stress, or any of those kind of trends?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually the opposite. So when a mom, and this is mostly from rat studies, but we see it also, there, increasing primate studies are on this too, but basically when the mom is under heavy stress, and her offspring get that signal in utero, when they're born, they actually also have a variable stress response that is much more, they're more, I guess you might call them dysregulated. They don't go up and down as much as, an animal whose mom was not stressed.
Very nice talk.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm actually a student in the field of stress research, and
good.
one of the things that we often run into is that we find it very hard to define the line between acute and chronic stressors.
Yep.
So we all know that acute stressors, are adaptive, as we talked about, and long-term stressors become maladaptive.
Right.
And so I wonder, at what point in your research have you seen this change happen? Is it on the order of days, months, weeks? And also, across the lifetime, at what point does this occur?
Right, that's a really good question. So I don't love the terms acute and chronic stress, because acute indicates a magnitude and chronic indicates a duration. And so they're not really, we use them so common that it doesn't matter anymore, so I'm not gonna change it. But, so this idea is, I think of acute stress as each one of those jumps, and over time, when they all blur together, you have one stressor after another, you just stay high. And even that isn't, I don't consider it chronic stress. But basically, let me just go back. That's sort of why I put this up here, because, it's essentially the accumulation of allostatic load. And you probably know a lot about allostatic load, but it's basically this idea that, here's just every stressor. This is a stress response and back down. And that's completely normal. We get those every day of our life. It starts to go into chronic stress when you have a lot of them. And I don't even know if I would call this chronic stress, even though the word is here, because this is someone else's figure. But now you're starting to get the ups and downs, or the staying up. But until it gets to here, I think there are stress effects going on here, but I think at this point it's still the benefit outweighs the cost. So this is the pink baboons, the ones that had high cortisol but survived the lion, or whatever lion we didn't measure. And so I wouldn't call this chronic stress. I don't think wild animals undergo chronic stress. I think they actually, the cost-benefit analysis is still good. They're still always going to be better off enacting a stress response. So even though it might happen all the time, the lions keep coming, it's still it's beneficial. So I don't know if I would call it chronic stress. It's not until it gets over here where you finally tip the balance into damage. Like now the actual stress response is killing you. And the animals are for whatever reason, you've tipped over here. Humans go here quickly because we have no benefits to enacting a stress response, unless we're lifting a car off a child.
Okay. That's kind of a simple question, but how extreme does your stress factor have to be to activate the core still? Or could it be more of like a minor, less extreme stress factor?
That's a good question. And so one thing I forgot to say in this talk is that our stress response is the same, regardless of what it is. Heat, cold, lion. Basically we have the same stress response. That's not entirely true. They're starting to figure out some little things, but for the most part, you can think of it as true. But the magnitude of the response correlates with the magnitude of the stressor. So me talking up here is a little bit stressful. But if I suddenly pulled one of you up here to give my talk, it might be a little more stressful. So we have, our response correlates with that. How big of a thing has to happen? That's kind of up to you, and I think, different individuals perceive stressors differently.
So when you were looking back on the previous droughts of each individual, did you look at multiple droughts or just one?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you know if the individual shows a similar stress response to the same stressor?
It's like you saw my notes. So repeatability is a huge deal in this kind of research. And unfortunately, we only had 1 or 2 droughts for each animal. So we don't have a really good measure of repeatability. It's a really data-hungry kind of analysis, and we need to do it. And that's Walker Stanton's PhD thesis, is to get that repeatability so we can replicate this study.
But do you know if in previous or like other studies that
Nobody has done this. Literally nobody has done repeatability of these reaction norms, with one exception. There's a bonobo study that looks at repeatability of diurnal rhythms, which is basically, how much does your waking cortisol go up before it goes back down again? It has nothing to do with stress. It just has to do with your diurnal rhythms. It's a really good, there's 2 studies out, and they're really good. And I might build off those, like I'm using those as a model for what we're going to do next.
So maybe this comes back to that like controllability, predictability piece of it, right? In humans, where most of our stressors have an imaginary consequence to them, there's this like stress recovery growth cycle where we might be better next time, right? You said like exercise, competition, thrill seeking. Like, is that response seen in places where there is a real consequence, and just eventually that consequence actually gets you if your stress response isn't as large or adaptive as in humans? Does that question make sense?
Maybe say it one more time. I think I understand. But
in humans, is there that difference in stress to like recovery to growth, where like does our cortisol, especially on the acute side, change? And do you see that in repeatedly stressed animals, say, but eventually the consequences just catch them?
I see. So I guess I'm back to repeatability, right? It's related? Yeah. So I think humans probably do have very different stress responses to different stressors, like things that might stress one parent out, the other parent's like, doesn't bother me. And so you get that variability, and I think that variability is widespread. For wild animals, we do have high variability, even in things that make no sense. So like, when I showed you that there's an infanticidal male and he's going to kill all the kids in the group, the females who have kids, even the ones without male friends, have a big amount of variability. So what's modifying that? And that's the scourge of studying behavior. It's not physics. We have so much variability, and our job is to see the pattern through the noise. But so I think, in a big world, we would be able to explain some of that variation, but I'm not convinced we can. Pretty.
So to what extent is it that human stress is psychological or fake, or to what extent is it that our cortisol response is not adaptive? So for example, if my Affordable Care Act subsidies are going to go away, I can predict the likelihood. It increases the chances that I won't get health care, and I might ultimately die because of that.
Right.
So it's maybe not an immediate, but I have some information that, because I can catastrophize. But on the other hand, cortisol is going to do me absolutely no good. And so it might be also that side of the equation that is the problem. And if we actually could raise our cortisol and therefore change something, so we don't have a mechanism there. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, this comes back to the mismatch between our current stressors and what we evolved to handle. And we evolved to, run from a lion, lift cars off children, all those things that require physical energy in our bloodstream. And even healthcare, where you're like worried about your healthcare because you might die, it's still not, evolution doesn't see that, because most of us, by the time we lose healthcare and die, have already reproduced. And, I think that there's other things at work. Like I think evolution in humans, besides like disease resistance, is not as, it certainly isn't going to catch up anytime soon based on, what we're dealing with here. Sorry, I had another thought and I just lost it. I probably didn't answer okay. I just talked about your question. I didn't answer it.
We've got time for one more question.
So this is kind of connected to the previous question about looking at if human responses to stress are adaptive. And in this talk, you talked a lot about how like we have modern medicine and all these amenities now that we don't really need that kind of stress response. So I'm wondering if you've looked into, say, like countries where that stuff is not as readily available, or where diseases tend to be just a lot more like prevalent and deadly, and if you think in those places the human stress response is still not adaptable.
It's a good question. So I don't, let's see. Interesting question. I don't know that I've ever actually thought about that. So I think my instinct, my gut is telling me that even in these other countries, it's still relatively maladaptive, because I think they're worried about childhood diseases taking their children. That's, again, cortisol is not going to help them take care of that. It's not a lion per se. I think there are energetic challenges in humans. And so in that sense, it's probably a little bit more at work, certainly. I think it might also be the case that, I do know that diabetes and cardiovascular disease are much less in countries where their challenges might be a little more physical than the challenges that we face. So there might be something there. I have to admit, I'm wading out of my depth right now because I'm not as familiar with the human literature. But it's a really interesting question. And often the questions I get in these talks are like what lead me to think about new research projects. So thank you.
I want to thank everyone for this evening, and let's give our speaker a warm thank you.
Thank you all.